Okay, hooray. Well done. Well done, us. That's how we'll start. Everybody put up your right hand and pat yourself on the back. We have navigated the Zoom room. Hooray. And so, Moni, I can't see you in my display anymore, but you tell me when to start, and I will start.
You can start. Thank you.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here again today to talk about some really neat work that has emerged after several years of testing of this particular hypothesis. This is a paper that came out in last month or middle of this month. Heat tolerance decreasing and cold tolerance increasing with elevation for a species-rich insect family on a tropical volcano. And this is a collaboration that Dan and Winnie and I have been working on for a while, and that my PhD student, Al Lareo, has been part of doing his doctorate work here at the University of Guelph. And so this is basically in the, I guess, 45 minutes where I would hope to go to is to talk about who the players in the play are and talk about the context that this sits within, which is largely Dan's mountain passes hypothesis. And I want to tell you a little bit about that. I'm sure most of you know all about it, but just in case there's anyone who isn't, who's watching now or who's watching on a recording in the future, this is a really elegant and lovely thing, and it's really come into its own in the past 20 years. We'll talk about the role of temperature, particularly for these little things that run the world, and we'll talk about a particularly diverse group of those little things, the staphylinids, or the rove beetles, and then we'll talk about how it's a product of the ACG, what was involved, who was involved, and then what this might suggest, what the results of this study might suggest for the future. Things we can do, things we ought to be doing. So in the bigger context is that this is part of a long-term study that exists in this place because of how supportive the ACG is to work like this, to understanding in this kind of unique hybrid approach that work like this only exists because of the decades of support and protection that the ACG provides. And that I think one of the things that in this, the next slide is going to be, well, I'll show it to you, but this is this is the PhD student who worked a lot on this. Al is a Brazilian and now Brazilian Canadian who came to Guelph with the hopes of working in the ACG. And so he as part of a global community of scientists, he is learning from these species and spaces that call ACG home. And of course, Dan and Winnie have been part of this and part of my experience of the ACG for more than 20 years now. And so I can't say enough thanks and to them and express enough my joy of being able to work with them for so long on questions like this. So thank you. And then also to all of the people of the ACG, of GDFCF, and Bosque, the parataxonomists at Cacao in particular have had a real part in to play in this data set, this temperature data set and this thermal tolerance data set. And of course, Roher and Maria Marta in terms of guiding my thinking and the long-term thinking of research in the ACG. And then literally all the folks, particularly in the Comador, for making sure that that when we're there in particular, when particularly this bald Canadiense is there, that he is fed and able to go up and to access these incredible places. And so, and that's me. Where I'd like to start is a photo of Dan and a paper with a QR code if you haven't actually read it. Why mountain passes are higher in the tropic, because this thermal tolerance story about how, that I'm going to talk about today, how these insects are dealing with, or what capacity they have to deal with the climate crisis of today and of the future, really has grown out of Dan's thinking that dates back to this paper in 1967. And Dan, in writing the paper, this is in the introduction, that he's intending to write this, to draw attention to the relation between tropical climatic uniformity and the effectiveness of barriers in preventing movement. So what does that mean for us sitting here today in our shared kind of Zoom experience? It means essentially it's calling attention to the fact that, as Dan said, the mountains, it's not the scale of the mountains, it's not the number of meters of elevation, but it's where it is and it's how stable those climatic regimes are across elevation that really matter to the biology that call those spaces home. So in a mountain like Cacao or Rincon de la Vieja or Orosí, that historically we would have seen an array of fairly uniform and stable climatic zones from the top, from the clouds down to the bottom to the dry forest. And I'm going to unpack that in the future. But mountain passes was really Dan's expression of this to the world at large. And I want to show you some analysis of how the world at large has received it. So this first graph on the top left is kind of looking, so it was published in 67, wasn't cited. So the frequency there is the frequency of citation of mountain passes in the general scientific literature. So for a long time, it did a good job as a scientific paper, not particularly one of Dan's in a roster of shining examples of well-cited citation classics. It was not that for about 20 years. It was a solid performer whose numbers kind of accumulated until it changed dramatically in the early 2000s. Now, it's another way of looking at it is the cumulative frequency of citation. So its total number through time is it is now of a classic. It has had papers written about it as a citation classic, more than 1,500. And another kind of a nerd specific measure of that is, pardon me, how many times have the papers that cite it been cited? And looking at that, this is like into 95,000. Like, so its impact on the world at large is increasing and is large already and is increasing. And a lot of that has to do with this bottom right-hand graph. So around just 2004, 2005, the citations for mountain passes all of a sudden start to include the word climate change or climate crisis. And you can see that then after that, they tend to track somewhat in concert. And so this is essentially, I would suggest this measure is the world kind of catching up to mountain passes and saying, oh, well, this is an elegant description that if there are stable climatic envelopes, kind of regimes stacked across elevation, and that most species experiencing those don't have any reason to move anywhere, that's a really good prediction or an expression of vulnerability in the climate crisis. When temperatures and the predictiveness of climate is really ultimately the thing that we anticipate changing. And so here's another measure of its impact around the world. This is for the first authors of all of those papers, where they sit around the world. See a lot in the United States, so let's take it for granted that the United States publishes a lot of papers, and let's de-emphasize the role of the US in this, and then look at the rest of the world. And you can see this is a paper that has been taken up by the scientific community and used essentially to think about how the biotic world is being affected by the climate crisis, and that is being used all over the world. This is a beautiful paper. And I'm really excited to be able to kind of think about things at the same time in the context of this paper. Now, it's elegant and useful because essentially I'll make the description that temperature and precipitation, these two abiotic variables, they predict so much about biology. Clearly not everything, but as Holdridge with his life zones and Whitaker with his biomes, and this is an expression of his biome, much of the biology of animals and plants can be predicted with information about the environmental conditions, environmental temperature and environmental moisture, precipitation. This is a classic description of the Whitaker's biome, that as you go up in temperature and up in precipitation, you see, and you can subdivide these. And Holdridge was really thinking in a Costa Rican perspective about subdividing these in really subtle and elegant ways, and in his attempt to describe a lot of the variation that he saw across elevation in Costa Rica. So it suggests the strength of these abiotic selective pressures. So I want to take, that's the mountain passes, and then I want to take a little bit of time to talk about how we've been measuring some of these elements across elevation in ACG since 2013. So since 2013, between Naranjo and La Cima, so the top near the top of Cacao down to the bottom, with there are 8 sites that have been measuring air temperature and soil temperature every 15 minutes since 2013. So more than 3.5 million different measurements. And for a long time, if you're interested in the data, it's public. You can scan it and go and have a look at it there. I was struggling with how to present this. And this is still kind of I'm going to show you 2 different ways of presenting all of this data. One of them is informed by Ed Hawkins from the UK and his warming stripes. So here on the right-hand side, you can see this is a progression of departures from the norm in a particular, I think this is for London. So the departures from the average annual temperature from the norm for London through time. So each one of those bars in his original presentation of the warming stripes is a year. And what I've tried to do on Cacao is to use each line, each vertical line you're going to see being a day, and the color intensity from blue, cold, and red to hot, representing the maximum temperature for that day. So let's take a look. This is the dry forest down at Naranjo, very, very hot. You can see cyclically kind of changing and the returns of the rain and a reduction in temperature, but then this kind of bellowing of hot and cold throughout time, which is very different from what we see in the cloud forest. This is at the top of Cacao, where we see some dark red days, but much more stable temperatures. And this is one of the predictions that Dan made, of course, in Mountain Passes, that when you have that arises from this stability is in a place like the cloud forest that historically had very stable, predictable cold temperatures that didn't vary very much, that there would be no kind of selective pressure for organisms to maintain their physiological capacity to deal with hot or to maintain their capacity to move, because the world was a pretty stable and predictable thing. So let's stitch all of those together and take a look from the clouds up here. So at the top of Cacao, down into the rainforest, into the dry forest. And this is from 2012, December 2012. Everything was kind of underway by March 2013, up until early January of this year, 2026. And you can see there's some breaks and interruptions coincident with some of the early stages of the lockdown. So let's zoom in and look. There's a 4-year chunk where you can see the dry forest, and let's zoom in even more and take a look at a particular year, because I think there's a couple of things to think about here from what we would expect and what we're anticipating that can be taken from this. One of them is that the stability of the higher elevations is much greater. There's much more variance. Let's flip that. Much more variance in temperature at the low elevations, much less variance at the high elevation. But you can see this is 2016, so another El Nino year. You can see this kind of, I'm going to trace it out with my my cursor. But this kind of here in April, at the tail end of the dry season, this reach up of all of the heat that's kind of chimneying up. And it's this encroaching heat and less predictable precipitation that is a concern to tropical elevations or high elevation communities across the tropics, not just in the ACG. Because of course, these high elevation communities, if you haven't been, or many of you have been to the top of Cacao, for those of you who aren't lucky to have been there yet, I'm going to take you there for 2 seconds. And you can get an impression of the wind. This is kind of looking towards on the path, looking towards the peak of Cacao, and it's a tough place to be an insect. If you're a thermophilic, a heat-loving thing, this is cold and wet. Dan has always described this. Dan and Winnie have described this to me as essentially trying to live life in the bottom of a refrigerator. But that chimneying of hot temperatures is associated with changes, particularly in this high elevation, in these high elevation cloud forests. Some of you have seen this on earlier iterations of this figure. What we're looking at here is temperatures only at the top of Cacao, where we've compared the daily, the average temperature for the day, for every day from 2013 to 2026. And we've compared it to the site average for 2014. So an early occurring first year of this data set where we had the whole year to say this is an average temperature for Cacao. And what we see already is their seasonality, even in this location that's moderately stable, you can see there are hotter than average days, colder than average days, hotter than average days here in orange and red above the zero, and colder than average days beneath the zero line. But if you're looking at that and you kind of stand back, and I'm guessing you're looking at that and kind of squinting and going, there's potentially a problem here because this is an expression of the problem of the climate crisis, is that the number of days above that average temperature is going up. And this isn't unique to the top of Cacao. This is the story. This is the story with data that we anticipate seeing across high elevations across the tropics. And so rather than there being the tumultuous storm inside of the cloud at the top of the mountain, we see increasingly days like this. And so in preparing or in thinking about what does a future without clouds look like, what happens to small leaf litter organisms, which are my particular thing that I like to listen to the most, what's going to happen to them in a future in the in the top of these volcanoes without clouds? Thermal tolerance, or estimating how well these organisms deal with high temperatures or low temperatures, is one estimate of how well they would cope. And I'm going to tell you about how we measured that after I introduce you to kind of some of the organisms that we looked at. And so these are all beetles. These are all rove beetles. So one family of beetles. If you haven't thought or had an opportunity in your life to think about rove beetles, I'm going to claim this 2 seconds of your life to say rove beetles are kind of amazing. We have described just over 64,000 species. We, the scientific world, has described 64,000 species of rove beetles, which means that already there are nearly as many rove beetles as there are species of vertebrates. They're gorgeous. Some of them, big, large ones that are kind of green and blue, some of them in the ACG have names. Most of them don't. Most of them fit the description of being kind of certainly less than a gram, less than a couple of millimeters, being small and brown, and in most cases having no name. Now we did, Dan and Winnie and I and another student of mine, Sarah Dolson, as well as Angel Solis and Adam J. Brunke, some other staphylinid taxonomists around the world, we looked at how this family of beetles was distributed across elevation in ACG, across Cacao and Rincon and Orosi. And what we found was what we called, or what the literature would characterize as, an anomalous pattern, a strange pattern. Diversity across elevation tends to go down, or like a little bit of a mid-elevation hump in diversity, go up and then go down. But with rove beetles in ACG, diversity and abundance just goes up. The greatest diversity and the greatest abundance are found in the cooler and the wetter places. And maybe we thought one of the things that Al, the PhD student involved in this project, he thought might be interesting to look at was are beetles different in displaying this kind of upward trends with elevation and diversity? Are they different? And what he found, while puzzling over it here he's puzzling over a sifter looking for beetles on the road to Naranjo. What he found was that there isn't. This staphylinid pattern is a staphylinid pattern at ACG, and there isn't really a global pattern. So before we get to unpacking the thermal tolerance things, let's just unpack kind of what we expect, or what we've seen with these groups to date. One of the things is that across elevation, from dry forest to rainforest to cloud forest, we see increasing diversity, and very different communities across elevation. That we don't see the dry forest species in the cloud forest. We see very few cases of cloud forest species in the rainforest. And so there's not a lot of these, there's zones of diversity, zones of which species lives where across elevation. And so the question that we had was, how could we ask, do they differ in their thermal tolerance? Now, from a mountain passes informed perspective, the suggestion would be, well, certainly they do, they must. And that's an interesting contextualization with some of where the literature was going in the mid 2010s, early 2020s, when a series of big papers in PNAS and the Proceedings of the Royal Society looked at meta-analyses. So looked at all cases where the thermal tolerance of an invertebrate had been measured, and they characterized it by family or by whatever taxonomic level they had, but they then compared it to elevation. And what they found was this statement at the top, that the heat tolerance of terrestrial ectotherms, like insects, didn't change with elevation. This was a surprise to me. It is what their data shows, but this didn't fit with my intuition, with Dan's intuition, with Winnie's intuition of what we ought to see, what those little things were telling us in the forests of cacao. So let's go to cacao and talk about staphylinids and how you find them. You get low and you move slow. So this is a video that I hope is running for you. Tell me or say something alarming in the chat if it's not. But this is Derumbe. So this is 1,300 meters on cacao on a day that is, as you can kind of see the blue sky peeking through there, a strange day already in that it is not raining. And this is a little tiny leaf sifter. So I've shoveled a bunch of leaves and some of the top couple of centimeters of soil into a wire frame, and I've sifted it back and forth. And my finger was just pointing there into the tray where there is one, there's many things in that tray, but one of the things that's in there right here is a tiny little oxytelin staphylinid. So you can see the kind of the sections of the body, and you see this beautiful thing. And there's the forceps for scale. There was an isopod that just ran by. But you can see these are small things. This is a hard, it's actually, I was going to say, it's a hard thing to do a tour for. Because they're small. It is actually, it could be a great tour because it's very predictable. They're an abundant group. And so if you go here and you sit down and you sift through the leaf litter, you do find them. But you really need kind of the addition of some microscopy. Maybe it's your phone, or maybe it's another kind of a lens. And so that's kind of the detail of looking for these staphylinids. Then the other additional question is, how are you going to identify them? I mentioned earlier that most of these things don't have a name. So how are we going to identify them in these kinds of analyses? Well, we're going to use DNA barcodes, and we're going to use DNA barcodes in bins or as our species proxy to identify them. So we go out into the field, we collect, we shovel, we collect, and we find these things. We bring them home back to Santa Rosa alive. And then this is the heat tolerance assay. The setup here is a sous vide cooker. Some of you might have one of these in your kitchen at home. They're actually a really durable and elegant field tool for conducting these thermal tolerance assays. So you record the assay, that's what the camera's doing there, and then you raise the water bath a half a degree Celsius and then hold for a minute, and then raise it another half degree Celsius and hold for a minute. And what you're looking for is, if you zoom in, you can see the top. There's two rows here. Let's look at the top because they're already moving around. You can see there's little spasms. So this is a sped up video, but it's that fast kind of up, down, up, down, up, down, that fast spasm. The onset of those spasms is is used as a physiological measure of critical maximum temperature. The maximum temperature they can live through, but then they can't live through. They will then die. So we run the experiment until they are dead, but what we're doing is watching the experiment and then the video to see when it runs, and when they die. So if we were going to see, we could sit here for several minutes and watch. This is a whole hour that's I've kind of sped up into a minute. But right off the bat, if I scroll this video back, there's two populations in those rays. The cloud forest is up here at the top, and this is the dry forest at the bottom. And the way that I've aligned the video, this is when they're experiencing the same temperature. And I think, again, standing back and looking at it, you can see the cloud forest is responding much earlier than the insects are responding much earlier than the dry forest insects at the bottom. So that's a little bit of the nuts and bolts about how we do the critical maximum temperature. The critical minimum temperature is done like this. So this is a CCRT, so the chill coma recovery time. And so what it involves is placing these insects, once we brought them back from the field, in a water bath for an hour, which slows them down, puts them to sleep. In some cases, it does kill them, but that's not the intent. What we're trying to do is just kind of reduce them to an immobile state. And then we put them in this array tray, again, while it's on ice. And then we film. And we record how long it takes for movement to respond. The last to move are the least tolerant. So the first ones to move are the ones that have dealt the best with the cold. And I'll show you what that looks like here. So there's the array in full, and this upper left-hand well that just started spinning its legs and stands up. This is kind of looping through. So we would have clocked that second, or the minute and second that one had responded to that. And if you look, here's another that is not responding yet. But if you look at the bottom in the middle, you can see this one in the center middle at the bottom, it's going to be like a minute later. So we have two then measures using these fairly simple and resilient estimations of thermal tolerance with the sous vide and the critical maximum temperature and the ice bath to estimate the critical minimum temperature. Now we end up with two different units. The critical maximum temperature is going to be in degrees Celsius. The critical minimum temperature in this case is in seconds, and I'll tell you about how we dealt with that in a second. But let's look a little bit at some of the data. So right now you're looking at the ambient temperature. This is the air. The trend is the same. There's less variation in the soil, but this is the trend for air across from Naranjo and down or up as the average goes down to the top of the mountain in the cloud forest. So dry forest here, and rainforest in the middle, and cloud forest at the top. And then we overlay the CT max for the taxa found in those communities across that elevation. And what we see is that much more variation at a community level for all of these species across in the dry forest, and much less variation in the cloud forest. And this is the quotes here, the italics. This is a quote from Mountain Passes in Dan's 1967 paper. The larger the usual variation around the mean environmental value, or in this case temperature, the greater the probability that an organism will survive a given deviation from that mean. This figure is an expression of that statement, that we have more variation in the dry forest, and we have a higher probability that the species from the dry forest will survive those higher temperatures. And we see that the thermal maximum temperatures do decline with temperature. What does that mean for the future? I'll tell you about that. Let's talk about that in a second. Let's look at the chill recovery time. So remember, longer times here are less. So there we've got time here on the Y. Longer times are less tolerant of the cold. And we see that this also declines slightly with elevation, so that dry forests have slightly less cold tolerance, but it's a much wider variation. And you might expect that. We kind of expected that going in, that that cold tolerance might not be selected for in the same stringent way that heat tolerance would be. Let's look at these for breadth as a measure. So we have a measure of extreme heat tolerance, extreme cold tolerance, different units, and how are we going to, those are the orange and apples, how are we going to compare those? Well, we're just going to use Z-scores. So Z-scores, if you're not familiar with them, they're just a statistical way that describes for any individual data point how great a departure it has from the mean, accounting for the standard deviation. It makes it a unitless number, essentially. And that is kind of an excellent way that statisticians and ecologists have used for a long period of time to compare measures that have been calculated with different units. And so what we see here is this expression. So a greater thermal breadth in the dry forest and less thermal tolerance writ large in the cloud forest. So thermal tolerance declining with elevation. For all of the species that we looked at, one of the natural questions that would arise is, are the ones that have the widest distribution perhaps the one that have the greatest thermal tolerance toolkit? That would be a reasonable supposition. And so what you see here, all these little ticks going from the bottom of the screen to the top are individual species. And then you've got for, if the species has been found across a wide range of elevation that's connected by a blue line, these little barbells. But you can see most taxa have only been found at one or two places, and that when thermal breadth, which is here coded in this color scale, you can see that there isn't really a link between the ones that are found at the widest elevational ranges don't necessarily have the broadest thermal tolerance. So broad thermal tolerance doesn't necessarily result in a wider elevational range. There are other things going on in this story. From a whole volcano, from a big picture perspective, kind of a small scale biogeography, big scale perspective across forests here in the ACG, what does this tell us, this kind of in-depth knowledge of these tiny little things that run the world? Well, if we look at the maximum, so these are soil temperatures, so site soil, average maximum soil temperature for each of these taxa on the day that they were collected, and then the critical maximum temperature that we determined from them. And what you can see is that this figure to me expresses the vulnerability of the cloud forest, that they are the species that live in the cloud forest are the ones that have the least tolerance for the oncoming kind of furnace of the climate crisis. Let's flip this for a second, though, and think about kind of a synthetic measure, this thermal safety margin. So that's what we call the difference between the heat tolerance of the species and the soil temperature on the day that it was collected, or for the site from which it was collected. And what we find here, the position, if I go back one slide, you can see that it's the cloud forest here at the base. This is an expression of the cloud forest having the least tolerance. Here we have the dry forest at the base. And what this is telling us is that the dry forest communities are the ones that are most quickly approaching, are already experiencing temperatures that meet or exceed their thermal tolerance capacity. So this is this thermal tolerance across elevation with this hyperdiverse group of insects. What is it telling us? It's telling us that there isn't really any part of the park that is going to be immune to the ravages of the climate crisis, that the capacity in the cloud forest is the least, and the dry forest is the place where it's already meeting or exceeding those capacities. The other thing that is interesting to me, and I'm going to tie this into the species number paper from the start of the summer. This is the data. Remember that I put up 3 different papers, and I said, in contrast to Dan's Mountain Passes paper, there is a lot of well-cited recent meta-analyses that said heat tolerance of terrestrial ectotherms doesn't change with elevation. This is their data. I'm going to add to that their data, your data from the ACG. For the ACG staphylinids. This suggests that, to me, that the meta-analytical approach, this is an inherent limitation of the other author's meta-analytical approach, because we don't know about the species. This is to say terrestrial ectotherms. If we've only named 3% of the species on the planet, we're not really in a position to talk with authority or confidence about what those changes are going to be, i.e. we need to fill that shortfall and know more about the capacity of the varied groups of invertebrates, the unnamed. So it's too early to say anything about ectotherms. And why is that? And it's because of quotes like this. This is a photo that Winnie took of Dan and I changing a tire on the Prado a few years ago, with Dan's quote that from an email that between you and me, there are at least 1 million species of insect in Costa Rica. And this is what others involved in the call and involved in this work, what we kind of talked about in this earlier this summer paper about the construction of a lower bound estimate of global number of species, that most of these things don't have names, and that we ought not to expect to be done naming insects when we get to, say, 6 million, that 14, 20, 30 million, this is an expression of the floor. And the Terry Irwin future of 30 million plus is really where we need to go. And what do we know about those taxa? Well, we haven't named them yet. We know very little about them. And remember, most of these staphylinids that we're dealing with in this study, none of them have names. So this is Dan and Winnie speaking in 2021 as the insectometers. Insect decline by climate change will be just another one of the 100 cuts that will kill arthropod and other biodiversity. So it's not just the millions of species threatened with extinction, millions upon millions. And I'll pull this last quote from Dan to think about that. It's even back in 1967, the number of days, the periods of time when temperatures on the pass were similar to the valley, i.e. temperatures at high elevation similar to low elevation, and the amount of time and the degree to which the organism can withstand those temperatures. That's essentially an expression of the thermal tolerance assays that we did. And these are important because those tight elevational bounds are changing and they're moving upslope. And in addition to that, they're moving upslope in an environment that is literally changing and becoming more dominated by fire. And so this makes me think about fire in other UNESCO World Heritage Preserves. This is one in 2019 in Paris that many of you knew about. And in a sense, it had a happy ending because the fire was extinguished, and because this UNESCO heritage site, the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, was well understood how it was built and what was in it, they could reconstruct it. And so with the start of the Summer Olympics in 2025, this was construction was nearly complete. Reconstruction was nearly complete. And so when we think about the ravages of the climate crisis and fires upon our World Heritage Site, the ACG, this is my plea, I suppose, that we continue knowing and listening to the little things that call this space home. And so what have we learned from them in this small paper? That we learned that the thermal tolerance for this really diverse group declines with elevation, that the cloud forest has very limited capacity for what's coming, and that the dry forest is already seeing, and we may begin to expect to see the extinction of some of these very small things. And in the face of that, what can we do? Well, as Dan and Winnie say in the insectometers, be kind to the survivors and make the conditions amenable to as many survivors as possible. What does that translate to? A lot of it translates to continuing to think about connectivity, connection, and space for those taxa that can move to redistribute themselves in the light of a changing climate. The importance for protection of as many spaces and as many forests as possible. I think it also, we need to act as advocates and to move these species into the taxosphere, move them into the formal literature, give them less molecular names and as many of them kind of formalized names so that we can talk to people about them. Because what we don't name, we don't care for, and what we don't care for, we don't protect. And continued encouragement for us to break this invertebrate shortfall of understanding of the species, of how they live their lives, of who else their lives intersect with, by examining tolerance patterns of other taxa in the ACG. So How can we continue to help that? We can continue measuring and monitoring temperature and precipitation to tell a data story, to tell stories with data, and to expand the measures to new locations and maintain in perpetuity. And we're doing that already. To train and engage parataxonomists in these measures of thermal tolerance, which is so hopefully something that we can do, because these are measures that they are eminently skilled and capable of delivering. So thank you. That's a bit of a whirlwind, and I will stop the share, but thank you for your interest, and I hope this sparks a discussion and gives you the capacity to share some of this enthusiasm with others in your worlds when you're talking to them about it.